Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can all see the screen with my slides being shared and can hear me. So I am Dr. Jessica Cook, Volac's Research and Development Manager, responsible for the Young Animal Nutrition R&D. I'm really pleased to be joining you today for this webinar and being part of the Great British Calf Week, because I have spent much of my life connected with the dairy industry. I grew up on a dairy farm in Sussex, and then I went on to complete a PhD at the Royal Veterinary College, where I was looking at the importance of factors during the calf rearing period and the impact that these have on the subsequent performance of the animals once they enter the milking herd. So data that I collected during my PhD, together with data from subsequent studies, has consistently shown that heifers calving down close to 24 months of age are those that have the best lifetime performance. So heifers calving close to 24 months of age have been shown to have better fertility, so fewer days to conception in lactation 1 and lactation 2, and significantly lower calving intervals. Heifers calving at 24 months have the best milk production, so they've been shown to have higher milk production over the first 5 years of their life, and importantly, higher lifetime daily yields, which is clearly what is important. Heifers calving at younger ages have also been shown to have improved udder health. So it's been shown that a lower age at first calving is actually associated with a lower somatic cell count in their first lactation. So taken together, this better fertility, more milk, better udder health, it results in these heifers actually having improved longevity. And it's been shown that it's the heifers that are calving down close to 24 months of age that have a much better chance of actually reaching a third calving. We know that heifers calving for the first time at 24 months of age don't actually become profitable until halfway through lactation 2. Therefore, it is fundamental that the heifers that we're rearing on our farm today actually survive until third calving to stay in the herd long enough to pay back that investment cost. So if heifers are to calve down at 24 months of age with adequate body size, we need to set targets throughout the rearing period to ensure that heifers are on the right growth curve and ultimately maximise the chance of growing better cows. Now, we all put a lot of focus on age at first calving, but actually it's really important they're the right body size. So at first calving, we need these heifers to be 85 to 90% of their mature body weight. And that's important because it reduces any calving difficulties, and also their body size at first calving has been linked with their subsequent fertility. So by making sure that you calve down at the right age and size, you're going to improve their subsequent performance. So to hit this target, we need to go back to day 1 and set them off on the right growth curve. So the first goal should be to double their birth weight by weaning. And then the next one is to be getting them the right size to breed for the first time at 13 to 14 months of age. And at this point, you want them to be 55 to 60% of their mature body weight. Now, it's important that we start breeding them at 13 to 14 months, because if they're to calve at 24 months, they clearly have to be in calf by 15 months. So we need to start breeding them at 13 to 14 months to give them enough time to actually get in calf to then be in calf by 15 months. So if we're aiming for 55 to 60% of mature body weight at 13 months of age, this equates to a daily live weight gain from day 1 through to 13 months of around 0.8 kilos per day. But of course, it will depend on the mature body weight of cows in your herd, but it's going to be close to sort of 0.7, 0.8 kilos per day. So whether you are rearing a heifer as a future herd replacement and trying to hit the growth targets that we've just looked at, or whether you're rearing the dairy beef calves and want to maximise their future value and selling options, we need to ensure that every calf on farm gets off to the best possible start. And the critical focus areas for success include the health, the environment, and the nutrition. So calves use their feed in lots of different ways. First, they must use it to maintain their normal body functions. Then they use it to keep themselves warm and to fight any diseases. And then finally, it's the balance that's left over that they can then use and put into their growth. This means that if you've got a healthy warm calf, it uses its energy most efficiently and has plenty available for growth. If we compare this to the sick cold calf, it's going to grow inefficiently and very slowly, simply because it has to use more of its energy that's going in the feed to keep itself warm and to fight disease by mounting that immune response. So it has very little energy left over for growth. And when we're talking about environmental temperature for the young calf, less than 3 weeks of age, anything less than 10 to 15 degrees C is cold for that calf. And at those temperatures, that calf, the young calf, is going to have to be using more of its energy to keep itself warm. So for the rest of my talk, I'm going to sort of focus on the nutritional side. And so going to start with colostrum management. And achieving early and adequate intake of colostrum is widely recognised as the single most important management factor in determining the health and survival of calves. But it also has been shown to have long-term benefits in terms of calf growth and development. So it's key that we get it right. And there's sort of the four key points to remember about colostrum. Firstly, we need to get the colostrum into the calves quickly. So you need to collect it and feed it within 2 hours of calving. And that's because at birth, the calf gut is extremely permeable to these large antibody molecules. And gradually over the first 24 hours, that gut starts to close. So the sooner you can get it into that calf, the more of those antibodies can actually be absorbed by the gut. The next factor is the quality of the colostrum, and colostrum quality can vary enormously between individual cows, and you can't determine the quality of colostrum simply by looking at it. You actually need to be testing it, so either with a Brix or a colostrometer. And if you're using Brix, it needs to be more than 22%, and if you're using colostrometer, it needs to be greater than 50 grams per litre. In terms of quantity, as a minimum, we need to be feeding 3 litres within the first 2 hours, followed by a further 3 litres within 12 hours. And you know, there is data now showing that actually, although the antibodies can't be absorbed beyond 24 hours, by feeding colostrum for the first 3 days and even your transition milk for the first week, that will actually have benefits in terms of gut development and health. And then the final consideration is to keep the colostrum clean. And bacterial contamination reduces the uptake of those antibodies. And bacterial contamination can occur from poor colostrum handling. So it's important that we keep all the feeding equipment clean. But it can also result from inadequate storage. So if you are storing colostrum rather than feeding it straight to the calf, it needs to be in that fridge or in the freezer, ideally within an hour of collection, to stop any of the bacterial growth, because bacteria can double every 20 minutes when left at room temperature. So this is some data from some recent studies in Ireland looking at colostrum management on farms. So the first figures are based on 66 dairy farms in Northern Ireland, and they found that 77% of farms fed 3 litres or more of colostrum in the first feed, which is great. So we're getting the quantity into them. A second study looking at 47 Irish herds found that 76% of farms fed colostrum within 2 hours, which as well is great to see that so many farms are getting that colostrum in quickly. But going back to the first study based on the farms in Northern Ireland, they found that only 14% of farms actually tested colostrum quality. And I think it's just really important to note that it's the sort of testing that quality is key, because if it's of a poor quality to start with and you've got a low level of those antibodies present, then it's not going to have the desired effect, because if the antibodies aren't there to start with, the calf can't absorb them. And no matter how much you feed or how quickly you feed, if it's of a poor quality, you're not going to get the desired level of passive transfer that you'd hope for. So moving on to milk feeding, the primary source of nutrition for a calf during the first 3 to 4 weeks of life is milk, and that's because starter intake is minimal. So feeding more milk, i.e. providing more energy to those calves from a few days of age, will help to maximize feed efficiency, prevent early weight loss, and maximize early growth potential. And I'm going to go through each of those points in the next few slides. Feeding more milk has also been shown to improve the health of these young calves. And that's because mounting an immune response is a considerable energetic demand. So if you put more energy into them, they're in a much better place to fight those disease challenges. And it's actually been shown that calves that are fed more milk are much better able to withstand disease challenges from crypto, salmonella, and respiratory disease better. Early nutrition is also important for developmental programming. So what happens to a cow's performance in the milking herd will be influenced by her early life development. And it's been shown that pre-weaning growth and nutrition have been associated with first lactation performance. So looking at feed efficiency. So feed efficiency is defined as the relative ability of the animal to turn feed nutrients into growth, and it's at its highest during the milk feeding period. So on this graph here, you can see that in the first 2 months, feed efficiency is up at 50%. So what this would mean is if you're feeding 100 grams of feed, you would expect around 50 grams of growth back out in ideal environmental conditions. By the time this calf has been weaned and sort of approaching 4 to 5 months, the feed efficiency has dropped down to 36%. And then at the point of sort of first breeding, it's down at less than 10%. So it's easy to see that for the same amount of feed, as that animal ages, you're going to get less growth back out. So we need to take advantage of that high feed efficiency in the first 2 to 3 months of their life and maximize their growth. So thinking about the growth potential of these young calves, this was some data from a study carried out at Liverpool University a few years ago, and they were feeding 2 groups of calves. One group, they were feeding restricted volumes of milk, so those calves were getting 5 litres of milk per day over the first 3 weeks. And then the other group were being fed ad lib from day 1. So you can see here that by day 5, they were drinking around 7.5 litres per day. And then by day 26, they were drinking upwards of 13 litres per day. They found that the biggest difference in growth rate was actually over the first 2 to 3 weeks of life, which is expected because that's when they're completely reliant on their milk feed, because starter intake is minimal over the first couple of weeks. So when looking at this graph here, you've got body weight against age over the first 14 days. Looking at the blue line, which is those restricted fed calves, you can see that these calves actually lost some of their birth weight. And it wasn't until around sort of day 3 to 4 that they'd actually regained their birth weight and then grew very slowly. So by day 14, they'd put on only around 2 kilos. And over the first 3 weeks of life, they had a growth rate recorded of only 0.17 kilos per day. Looking at the ad lib fed calves, you can see that from day 2, these calves simply thrived and grew. By day 14, they had put on 7 kilos, and over the first 3 weeks, they were having growth rates of around 0.7 kilos per day. So, it just shows that if we provide these young calves with enough milk over the first few weeks of life, they've got an enormous potential for growth. And we know that over the first 2 weeks, calves do experience significant health and environmental stresses, which is why it's really important that we actually feed them enough milk to allow them to grow. So how much milk should we be feeding these young calves? Well, traditionally, we would have built up the amount of milk offered quite slowly and then rapidly wean them. But what we actually need to do is flip that milk curve on its head. So we need to feed these young calves more milk from an early age and then actually wean them more gradually. So following the colostrum feeding period, from around day 7, you need to be getting these calves on around 6 litres of milk per day. If you're going to take that milk allowance up further, you need to reach the peak milk allowance by around 2 weeks of age. And it's by feeding them more from this from day 7 and over the first sort of 2 to 5 weeks of their life. That's what's very much going to help support the health, the growth, and the development of these young calves. Just a note on meal size. So if you are feeding twice a day and want to go beyond feeding 6 litres of milk per day, then you should really be sort of keeping maximum meal size to 3 litres per feed. So if you do want to increase your volume beyond 6 litres, then you'd have to think about introducing a third feed. What is then is important is that we wean these calves over a 3-week weaning period. And that's important to stimulate starter intake, stimulate the rumen development, which will then benefit their digestibility and ultimately ensure these calves are better equipped to cope with the weaning transition. And I will come back to starter intake and weaning towards the end of my presentation. This milk feeding curve should be used as a guide only because the target for every farm should be to double birth weight by weaning. So if you're not managing to make sure every calf has doubled their birth weight by weaning, we need to go back and look at the triangle of the health, the environment, and the nutrition. What bit's not working, and you may need to feed more milk to suit your system, to suit the environmental challenges, and ensure that those calves are all doubling their birth weight by weaning. In addition to feeding more milk to maximize growth, the type and the quality of the ingredients in a milk replacer will also determine calf performance. So this was a trial that we carried out recently where we were feeding calves either a milk formula based on a high level of AminoPro, which is our concentrated whey protein and phospholipid base, and comparing it to calves being fed a milk formula with a low level of AminoPro. And what we found was that the calves being fed the milk formula with a high inclusion level of AminoPro grew faster. So they were on average 4 kilos heavier at weaning on day 56 compared to those calves being fed the milk formula with a low inclusion level of AminoPro. So it just shows that not only is it the amount we're feeding, but actually what's in the milk replacer will all sort of determine the calf growth and development. And actually, if you choose the right milk formula, will help to support the growth and health of those calves. So when thinking about sort of milk replacers, you need to be choosing one that's right for your calves. So is it your replacement heifers that you're rearing, or is it the dairy beef calves that you're rearing, and choose an appropriate milk formula. Always check the ingredients and use one based on sort of good quality ingredients. And then key things to remember is sort of always check you're mixing it as recommended, and check the mixing and feeding temperature. And again, use thermometers to just check that you are feeding at the right temperature. And of course, with any young animal, hygiene and consistency is key. So feeding more milk will help maximize the growth, health, and long-term development of these animals. But actually, feeding more milk may delay solid feed intake simply because the high milk-fed calf won't be driven by hunger to eat the starter. Any delays in solid feed intake can then compromise rumen development, leading to poor growth and feed efficiency in the weeks immediately after weaning. So, especially when we're feeding higher volumes of milk, it is critical that we manage that weaning transition properly. And we need to balance the intake of nutrients from both milk and solid feed in the last few weeks of weaning. So by balancing the nutrients from milk and solid feed, We're going to maximize the nutrient intake because obviously you want that calf eating as much solid feed alongside its milk as possible. You'll help ensure good rumen development at weaning. And rumen development is largely driven by the fermentation of the starter by the rumen bacteria. And, so the more starter that calf is eating, the better the rumen will be developed. And that's really important because when you come to wean these calves, the day you remove the milk, they're completely reliant on the starter. And unless you've got a well-developed rumen, it won't actually be able to utilize and digest the nutrients in that starter. Balancing the nutrients from the milk and the solid feed will also help maximize the feed efficiency. And the feed efficiency is the highest during the milk feeding period, but actually it still remains relatively high immediately after weaning. So the more they're eating at weaning, the more you're going to maximize that sort of relatively high feed efficiency at that point. It will help maintain growth and reduce the risk of any setbacks around weaning. Again, because the more starter they're eating, obviously the more nutrients they're taking on, but the more starter they're eating, the better develop that rumen, so they can actually go on to utilize and digest the nutrients. And then there is also data showing that weaning dry matter intake is positively related to their first lactation performance. So the general recommendation is to wean calves when they're consuming between 1.5 to 2 kilos of starter per day. But as I said, it can be a challenge to get these high milk fed calves to eat the starter. But various studies have now shown that sort of dietary and management factors can help encourage starter intake in these high milk fed calves. So firstly, providing palatable fresh starter and water from day one is absolutely key. Social housing, so pairing or grouping your calves from day 7 can actually help encourage starter intake. And that's because of the peer stimulation that the calves get from each other. They see another calf eating, so then they eat more themselves. Providing chopped forage ad lib and separately from the starter, so ideally in a separate bucket from the starter, has also been shown to encourage starter intake. And that's because the function of that forage is not nutritional. It sort of functions as helping to keep the rumen healthy. So by keeping that rumen healthier, it actually encourages the calf to eat more starter. And then finally, we need to reduce the milk over a 3-week weaning period. And, this will very much help drive the starter intake in the run up to weaning and make sure you've got a well-developed rumen at weaning so that the calf can actually digest those nutrients. And it's been shown that it very much is the cumulative amount of starter that they've eaten in the run up to weaning that's important for rumen development. So just to summarise before I hand over to Abby, calving heifers at 24 months of age is associated with increased survivability and increased lifetime yield, creating an efficient and sustainable system. And whether it's the replacement heifers or the dairy beef calves, we need to get them all off to the best possible start and get the nutrition, the health and the environment right. So take advantage of the high feed efficiency in the first 2 to 3 months and maximize their growth potential. Use a high quality milk formula to help support better calf growth, development and health. And finally, do those sort of various different management treatments to help encourage starter intake so that you basically make sure that calf is better equipped to cope with the weaning transition and you don't see any setbacks in growth around weaning. I haven't gone into detail in it today, and I think Abby's going to pick up on it, but we do need to be measuring and monitoring heifers. Firstly, that's important to sort of highlight any groups that aren't quite hitting the targets, and then you can do something about it. But actually also, if you're doing everything right and heifers are growing extremely well, then we need to be measuring them so that the minute they hit that 55 to 60% of mature body weight, we can start breeding them, get them in calf, get them on their way to calving down at 24 months and ultimately entering the milking herd and yielding some profits. Thank you very much. I look forward to taking questions after Abby's presentation.
Thanks, Jessica. So before we move on to Abby, I thought we'd try and activate your polls to see who's still with us. That was really great. And I think, one of my take-home messages from your talk was, getting that rumen development really is key. So I'm going to run one of your polls now, which is, what age do you calve the majority of your heifers at? Be interesting to see this one. So everybody, hopefully they'll be able to see this on the right-hand side of their screen if they can click on the app side. And let's see what people say. Oh, the majority, a whopping majority at currently 82%, 83% says they're calving at 23 to 25 months. Jessica, have you got any comment on that? Is that exactly what you were hoping to see there?
All I can say is that's super to see, and keep up the good work.
Brilliant. And let's see who's testing the quality of their colostrum. So question here on the right hand side, do you test the quality of all of the colostrum fed? Oh, we're creeping up on the nose there, but still majority saying yes. Jessica, have you got any words on a quick roundup on the importance of testing quality?
Yep, I think, as I said, actually testing the quality is important because it does vary enormously between cows, and you can't tell the quality just by looking at it. And like anything, if the starting quality is not good to start with, then no matter how quickly or how much you feed, if the antibodies aren't there, then the calf won't be able to absorb them, and you won't get the desired effect in terms of passive transfer. So it's just really important to take that time. If you're going to the time of getting the colostrum into the calves, make sure you test it and complete the circle.
Brilliant. I think our recommended mechanism of testing is using a Brix refractometer. So for those of you that follow us on Facebook, if you keep an eye out, we do tend to give them away in competition posts. So you have to keep your eyes peeled for that.